Hello, my name is Fred Abon. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Savage Philosopher. Today I'm going to be talking about three big topics, one of which I have no real training in, but I have a very avid amateur interest in, and that's cosmology. The second is consciousness, which is something I've studied a little bit more in depth in a philosophical and you could even say metaphysical sense. And then the last one is astrology, which I do have a lot of training in. And I'm going to try to work my way down from those scales. And I'm not going to be talking about everything in cosmology, but in particular something called the block universe theory, or B theory of space-time, and how that might reflect, or how astrology might connect to the inherent, in some sense, determinism that's implied in the B theory of space-time. I'll get to that in a minute. I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a larger perspective first to talk about what modern astrophysicists and modern cosmologists know about how the universe works and what they don't know. And if any of you are followers of this topic, you'll know that basically what they would say is they don't know very much about how the universe is composed, how it really works. The latest statistical statistical figures on what modern astrophysics and physics is actually certain about, and what they've studied and what they've measured, is really only 5% of the universe. So that's not what they would call ordinary matter, and what they've been able to sort of directly test and directly investigate, or indirectly test and investigate, or infer from their experiments. It turns out that that's only 5% of what they can measure in the universe. And the rest of the universe is broken up into two different dark categories. Dark meaning dark to us, to physicists and astrophysicists, and cosmologists meaning they don't know what it is. Dark matter is about 25 or 23% of the universe, and then something called dark energy. And these things are only known by their effects, but not by direct measurement. But they do know at least the percentages for sure, because of their effects on ordinary matter in a lot of ways, and also something called redshifting, and the expansion of the universe that they've mentioned, the accelerated expansion of the universe, that kind of disproved an earlier intuition that the universe was probably slowing down. But that's not what I'm interested in, and anything that I might say about that would be even dumber than than what educated people on this matter would say, because if they don't know anything, then I certainly don't know anything. But there is some consensus about the shape of the universe, that it's basically flat, and that it probably is a block universe. And this is the thing that I've found really interesting, especially when it comes to my practice or my interest in astrology. So the basic concept of the block universe theory, which I might butcher, but hopefully I'll be able to communicate this in relatively understandable terms, is that after the Big Bang, once the Big Bang occurred, basically the entirety of the universe came into existence, and so that it's all present now. And using that term now is even misleading, because now implies time as a separate entity, and from Einstein we know that time is not separate. Time is part of a four-dimensional universe, which includes the three dimensions of space and then this other dimension of time, and they're all tied together into something called space-time. And what that suggests, and what is so upsetting to a lot of people, is that if the universe and the past, the present, and the future are all in existence at once, I guess you could say, then a few different questions arise. Can we travel back in time? The answer is no. There's some things about what's called the entropy. Increasing entropy is one of the kind of rules of the universe. And the question about knowing the future, that the future isn't unknown, it's just unexperienced by, and this brings in the question of consciousness, which I'll get to in a minute. It hasn't been experienced by what we might call individuated perspectives on consciousness or awareness. And here I'm using the language of a philosopher whose name is James Corrigan, who wrote a great book on the nature of awareness or consciousness called An Introduction to Awareness. And I'll be referring to that in a little bit more detail in a minute, but the basic idea is that one analogy for this B theory of time and space is that it's a bit like a completed novel that you might be holding in your hands. And the entire plot line is already complete in this novel. But in order to actually experience it as a reader, you have to turn each page and actually invest your consciousness in what's developing page to page. But you could actually, if you wanted to, flip to the end of the novel and find out how everything resolves. And so the B theory, block universe theory, says that that is actually the case in our universe. And so that creates problems for people who and by the way, this theory is not entirely new in philosophy. Plato had a moving picture of eternity theory way back. I think he talked about it in the Timaeus. In Catholic philosophy / theology, Boethius also talked about this as the way that God basically experiences eternity. He knows the kind of the entirety of existence, but we don't, because we are individuated, souls, at least in the theological sense. So this physical theory has roots that go back into philosophy, but haven't been mathematized, I guess is the way to put it, and that's what the physics of this cosmology has added to the theory, or to the speculation. There are a few interesting books about this from a philosophical standpoint. I haven't read this one, but I've been reading reviews about it, called Objective Becoming by Brad Scow. He's a philosopher at MIT, I think. And he says some interesting things about what this means for human identity and people. And that the way we think about our identities as kind of separate, independently existing pieces of identity or existence is not correct. It's let's see. Let me see if I can read this. Oh, and it's also about the idea that we experience time as linear and passing moment to moment. and that once the past is past, we can no longer, it's gone forever in some sense. Even though maybe we have memories of it, it is no longer accessible. And in the B theory of time, while that's partially true, I guess is the way to put it, the past is perhaps no longer accessible to our consciousness, but it still exists in the block universe. He says, this is a quote from an article on his book, "We exist in a temporarily scattered condition. The block universe theory says you are spread out in time, something like the way you're spread out in space. We're not located in a single time." So in other words, this is where things get weird and interesting from my perspective, especially when we think about astrology. Each of us, and everything that has ever existed, I guess, is not this single physical entity moving through space and time. We are, in some sense, smeared out over time. We're not points, but we are, I don't know how to discuss this, how to, not points, but maybe bits of informational patterns smeared out over time that have some coherence until death, and then that bit of the eternal universe is either transformed or just it disappears out of existence and is replaced in some sense by some other some other form. But so from my perspective, that's interesting in a astrological sense, because what I've taken for granted after doing astrology for as long as I've been doing it, that the past and the future are in some sense mappable for what we think of as individual humans, but may in fact be just time slices, space-time slices, but cohered into a specific pattern. And that's what the astrology chart, not the astrology chart alone, but it is one of the tools that one can use to identify how this pattern plays out in this B theory, this block universe. And as far as I know, there aren't any other tools that have that projective quality, although maybe genetics is one of those developing mechanisms where once the combinations for certain, maybe diseases or specific personality traits, maybe the science will develop so deeply that the things that are often identifiable in an astrology chart can also be read through the genome. I suspect that will probably be the case. But as it stands now, the only thing that I've actually experienced directly as providing, kind of verifiable projections about individual experiences, both in the past and in the future, is some form of astrology or divination, and there are many of those. But as we know, those types of things aren't seen as anything you should really pay attention to if you're a serious human being. But that's another discussion that is kind of tiresome. However, so I've, again, the block universe theory is something that seems to me intuitively and even scientifically in some sense valid. What that physical theory doesn't really address is the question of consciousness, and this is something that cosmologists, physicists, philosophers have all thrown up their hands about, because it is like space-time in some sense, something you can't more. It's actually more like dark matter and dark energy, something we can't directly measure, but we have a suspicion that it's there, and even a strong intuition that it's underlying everything. There are scientists, especially neuroscientists, who are making some guesses and taking empirical stabs at measuring something called, well, what we call consciousness. And there's a few, I guess you'd call him he's a neuroscientist, but also has a very philosophical side to him, and his name is Giulio Tononi, and he has this theory of what's called phi, P-H-I, and he has a theory, but that phi is some sense a placeholder for what we call consciousness, which is simply awareness. So consciousness equals awareness, and not consciousness, not self-consciousness, but just consciousness, period. And he has a theory called integrated information theory that relates, in human brains at least, or in organic matter, that you can have higher or lower levels of this phi component. And he has done a lot of work to try to build the scaffolding for this theory, and in order to put some legs under the idea that consciousness is fundamental. And that's really what it comes down to, that consciousness itself is part and parcel of, I would say, the universe itself, that it underlies, or even that is a mischaracterization, because it suggests here's the universe and here's consciousness sitting underneath it, and it's more like consciousness is just pervading, which is some way related to the idea of panpsychism, which is a philosophical theory about the nature of matter and experience and consciousness. And, kind of in a nutshell, what it says is that everything in existence, all the ordinary matter, that 5% of the known universe, of the universe itself, that physicists and cosmologists are sure is there, all of that is conscious, has some measure of phi, and some aspects of that ordinary matter have high phi, and some have low phi, but all of it is, imbued with phi, or consciousness. And there are some very respectable philosophers who have been toying with this idea and have been trying to sort of kind of crack open the lid on the taboo against importing anything like vitalism or spookiness into matter, which has been the kind of the stance that many physicists have taken, is that consciousness is really just an epiphenomenon. It's just something that is like an illusion that arises out of the activity of brute matter, that is organized in a complex manner. And so there are philosophers who are pushing back on that, and now this neuroscientist is also pushing back on it. And that not all cosmologists are resistant to that idea. A lot of them, someone like Max Tegmark, who I find is a very deep and open thinker on this stuff. He's a mathematician and a physicist who is very interested in consciousness, but he has a specific spin on it, which is that consciousness is what he calls substrate independent. It doesn't rely on, for example, the human biology to exist, and so that squares with this idea that consciousness is can be attributed to anything at all. Even a rock, in some level, has some measure of phi or consciousness. Okay. Other philosophers who are very, vocal and deeply interested in consciousness and how it squares with physics are people like David Chalmers, Galen Strawson to some extent, and Thomas Nagel. All of these are, I think, philosophers who are doing interesting work on consciousness and trying to kind of build arguments, but also just give life to the conversation that the typical way of thinking about consciousness, which is grounded in physics, it might not be sufficient. And especially when you take into account the B theory of the universe, and then are humbled by the fact that basically 94% of the universe is composed of some energy or matter that is utterly beyond our grasp or our measurement. And to me, that's a happy thing, not a bad thing. I think it leaves open the opportunity to investigate multiple ways of understanding what consciousness is and what the universe is. The bringing it into the question of astrology, I would say that, like I said, the B theory of the universe is a new theory mathematically, but not a new theory philosophically or even theologically. And the fact that one can look at an astrology chart and have some insight into, again, both this idea of the past and the future, and the present, of course, suggests to me that there's something about the B theory that is probably correct. When it comes to the question of consciousness, I like the way James Corrigan talks about this, and he's most likely not the only person to discuss what consciousness is. And so the term consciousness and awareness I see as interchangeable. He prefers the term awareness as the kind of the substrate, the ultimate substrate of the universe itself, which is which allows for what he calls individuated perspectives on awareness. And I would suggest that we are each, every human is an individuated perspective on awareness, and that that our intuition is the kind of, is what I'm calling a threshold faculty. It's the thing that allows us to recognize this level of this awareness, this kind of fundamental property of the universe, that's tied to this individuated perspective on that thing. And so the question about how and why we, and what the role of dark, this is my speculative piece of this whole thing, which is that consciousness, individuated perspectives on consciousness is basically everything, is all the ordinary matter in the universe, including biological creatures such as us. But that the dark energy, which is the thing that creates basically the momentum so it's directly tied to time, because time doesn't, time requires movement or motion, is the thing, and it's the densest energy in the universe. 75% or so of the universe is tied to this entropic force, which is pulling, um, which is heading towards um, perfect disorder rather than order. And in some sense, this is where the stories of, especially the Hindu mythology about universes coming into being and disappearing, um, has some interesting corollaries with this idea of the Big Bang and perhaps the Big Rip at the outer end of this block universe, where the entropy maximizes and the universe in some sense goes out of existence. And then there's one theory that says the time in another, at the Big Bang there were actually two events, you could say, and they went in different directions. So in another universe, everything is being experienced in reverse. But it's a great idea. I love it. But inaccessible to us. And I don't think anyone has done the calculations to prove that is the case. But entropy and the kind of direction of time, the arrow of time, has gotten pretty solid, as much as you can, proof through by cosmologists and astrophysicists. So I guess the summation of my thinking on this is that thinking of that, I just find it very interesting that physicists, cosmologists are and philosophers on consciousness and the block theory are repicturing humans and basically anything as a bundle of information in some sense that is animated, and I would say animated by consciousness, not awareness. So consciousness being individuated, whereas awareness is the substrate of that consciousness, and that it's moving through space-time because of dark energy and dark matter. Secondarily, dark matter is creating the separation on a galactic level, but dark energy may be doing that on a pulling. In some sense, I've imagined dark energy as dragging consciousness or awareness, not consciousness, I would say, through space-time towards the ultimate big rip or big crunch, depending on what that is. Okay, those are some of my thoughts on it. And like I said, ultimately, I find that astrology, at the very least, is in line with the block theory of the universe. And so I would be happy to hear what you might think about this totally speculative idea about cosmology, consciousness, and astrology. And thanks for watching. Bye.